Using the approach set out in our revised strategic framework and based on clinical advice, our assessment is that the virus continues to present a medium threat. However, we remain optimistic that it will move from medium to low over spring. As a result, we consider that the overall transition signalled in the strategic framework remains appropriate. We should and will continue the transition away from legal requirements to advice and guidance instead. Therefore, I can confirm firstly that from Friday, and in line with other UK nations, all remaining COVID-related travel restrictions will be lifted. While we do have some concerns about this, UK travel patterns mean that diverging from the rest of the UK would cause economic disadvantage without delivering any meaningful public health benefit. We do, of course, retain the ability to reintroduce measures if, for example, a new variant emerges. Then, secondly, from next Monday, 21st March, with one temporary precautionary exception, the remaining domestic legal measures will be lifted and replaced with appropriate guidance. That means on Monday, the requirement on businesses and service providers to retain customer contact details will end, and so too will the requirement for businesses, places of worship and service providers to have regard to Scottish Government guidance on COVID and to take reasonably practical measures set out in the guidance. The exception relates to the requirement to wear face coverings on public transport and in certain indoor settings. Given the current spike in case numbers, we consider it prudent to retain this requirement in regulation for a further short period. I know this will be disappointing for businesses and service providers such as daycare services. However, ensuring maximum continued use of face coverings will provide some additional protection, particularly for the most vulnerable, at a time when the risk of infection is very high, and it may help us get over this spike more quickly. We will review it again in 2 weeks before the Easter recess, and our expectation now is that this regulation will convert to guidance in early April. The other issue I want to cover today is testing. Regrettably, our freedom of manoeuvre here is severely limited by the fact that our funding is determined by UK Government decisions taken for England. However, we have sought as far as we can to reach the right decisions for Scotland. It is important to note that we are aiming for the same long-term position as England on testing. However, we consider that the transition should be longer. In England, testing for people without symptoms ended in mid-February and will do so at the end of this month for those with symptoms. We intend the transition to last until the end of April. This is as far as we can go within funding constraints, but this does allow us to take account of current case numbers and better support the shift in our management of the virus overall. A paper has been published on the Scottish Government website setting out the detail. However, in summary, for the next month until Easter, there will be no change to our testing advice. If you don't have symptoms, you should continue for now to use a lateral flow test twice weekly, daily for 7 days if you are a close contact of a positive case and before visiting someone who is vulnerable. If you have symptoms, you should continue to get a PCR test either at a testing site or by post. However, following the Easter weekend from 18th April, we will no longer advise people without symptoms to test twice weekly. With the exception of health and care settings, the advice to test regularly will also end from 18th April for workplaces and for early learning and childcare settings, mainstream and special schools and universities and colleges. However, until the end of April, we will continue to advise using LFTs daily for 7 days if a close contact and on each occasion when visiting a hospital or a care home. And until the end of April, we will continue to advise those with symptoms to get a PCR test. Contact tracing of positive cases will also continue until the end of April. PCR test sites will remain open during this period, though opening hours and locations may change during the transition. Presiding Officer, though, as with all measures, we will keep it under review, our intention is that from the end of April, all routine population-wide testing will end, including for those who have symptoms. Contact tracing will end at this point too, although people with symptoms of respiratory illness will be advised to stay at home. Physical test sites will close at the end of April, although mobile testing units and lab capacity will be retained for our longer-term testing purposes. We will do everything we can to support those who have worked on the testing programme during the transition, and I want to thank all of them for their invaluable contribution over the past 2 years.